Hey, what's up, everybody? Much love and respect to everybody that's tuned in. May you be blessed. Hope everybody's doing good. Thanks for joining me one more time here. Today we're going to continue reading from the book Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history by Elizabeth Hirschman and Donald Yates. And today we're going to go right into chapter 8. This is how far we've gone along in this book so far. And yes, I have done a couple of videos already on the Huguenots. We also did a special on South Carolina, which involved a lot of the Huguenot information. But today I want to actually read the whole chapter from start to finish. Before we begin, though, I wanted to go ahead and remind everybody who the Huguenots are. From this book, History of the Conquest of Spain by the Arab Moors, okay, with a sketch of the civilization which they achieved and imparted to Europe by Henry Copy. I'm gonna go to page 445 in this book, and it talks about Columbus, what his name really meant, the Christ bearer, because he brought the Christ, right? How he brought only evil to the Aborigines in America, and that to him, what he dispensed of Moorish civilization was only good. Right, Moorish civilization. His vessel was fitted out in the little port of Palos, which had lately been a Moorish port. His sailors were many of them men with Moorish blood in their veins, okay? It has been asserted when the Moors were driven out, thousands took refuge in the south of France, who afterwards, abhorring the Roman Catholic persecutions, became Huguenots, all right? Who became Huguenots? The Moors. When they got kicked out of Portugal and Spain, that ended up in southern France, there, all right, they became known as Huguenots, okay? Who are the Huguenots? Moorish people. Huguenots, Moors, Huguenots, Moors, Huguenots, Moors. You guys clear? And that of these, many emigrated at a later date to South Carolina, all right? That's what we're gonna get into today. So we come back to the book Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America. We're in chapter 8, Huguenot, South Carolina. Okay, here we go. The crypto-Jewish element in the Carolinas, large French population, goes back to the first pogroms against Spanish and French Jews in the 1380s and 1390s. Even before this, however, events had the effects of throwing the two groups together. The union of the two was particularly strong in the Spanish marshes and southwest of France. Here, the Babylonian exarch Makhir William of Toulouse had founded a Jewish principate under Charlemagne around the year 770 AD, while the Makhidi dynasty suffered increasing inroads on their autonomy by the surrounding Christian barons and soldiers of fortune, and while the papacy fought incessantly against the legitimacy of the Narbonnese government and its nobles, the Jews clung as best as they could to their titles and possessions. Not surprisingly, it was in Toulouse that the Inquisition was first implemented in 1208. It was claimed that a papal legate was murdered by an agent serving the Count of Toulouse. Innocent III declared a crusade against the entire region. Right, so again, the Catholics were after these people from way back in this area. Under zealots like Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 people were massacred in the name of the purity of Christian doctrine. Despite bell, book, and candle, despite the ethnic cleansing, and despite the scorched earth warfare of French and English usurpers, however, the rulers of the Babylonian state and its chiefdoms continued to wield influence in the region of Septimania and Auvergne for several centuries. As late as the 1400s, there were still Nesum, plural of Nazi prince, a Nazi prince. Remember, that was a title for Jewish Sephardic Jews under the Moors, officially seated in Narbonne. According to Adolf Zuckerman, the historian who rediscovered this medieval Jewish state, the only one ever to have existed outside the Middle East, the extensive properties held by the Jews and their Nazi entitled king at the time of their expulsion in 1306 indicates that they occupied a very substantial portion of the city into the 14th century. Even after this, Jews, or better said by now, crypto-Jews, continued to maintain large estates over a broad region ranging from Urgell and Elne in Catalonia to Lunel, Uzes, and Orange in Provence. As the state waned and declined, Makir's great library and academy were transferred to a Christian monastery outside Narbonne. Evidently, many other Jewish institutions and practices gradually went underground. At the same time, in southern France, crypto-Jewish expert Abraham Lavender proposes that many Huguenots began as Jews, while Cecil Rothe, the chronicler of the Spanish Inquisition, writes that a large number started out as Muslim Moors, okay? So again, it's a little bit of both. A lot of Muslim Moors, especially when they got expelled from the Spanish Inquisition, their fortunes were variable. Jews had temporarily returned to France beginning in 1361 at the invitation of Charles V, all right, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, although they were expelled by his Catholic-leaning successor in 1394. And just remember again, Charles V was a so-called black man. Henceforth, even if the border was officially closed to Jews, they took ready refuge with their co-religionists, long established around Toulouse and elsewhere in Languedoc. Not only 1501 was there an edict of expulsion in Provence, and even then there remained shifting pockets of freedom in Avignon, Toulon, and elsewhere. Quoting Sakar, Lavender notes that although most of the province Jews departed in 1481, a tiny community underwent baptism and remained on. Nevertheless, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, augmented by periodic rivulets of Sephardic fugitives, the little enclave of provincial conversos began to regain something of its former demographic vitality. We can see in such stories the inevitable blending of Huguenots and Jews. In 1550, a proclamation of French King Henry II allowed Portuguese conversos to settle in France, all right? Portuguese conversos, remember, these are people of color. When we talk about conversos, these were the Moors and the Sephardic Jews converting to Christianity by force. This was little more than a concession to political realities. In 1656, Louis XIV issued an edict which in effect confined them to Bordeaux, Bayonne, and the surrounding areas. As Lavender notes, the French king no longer believed in their Catholic camouflage and began to treat the merchants Portuguese as Jews. The merchants, who's the merchants? The Portuguese. Remember what we learned about the Portuguese Jews? They were very dark complexion. We have the primary sources, the anthropological books. We've already shown that. So Louis XIV was like, I don't buy your Catholic camouflage. I know you guys are Jews, so-called Jews. If viewed as Jews, they would have no status and would have to pay exorbitant taxes for rights the Novus Christians, or the new Christians, had always freely enjoyed. The worst was over, however, and gradually the Nouveau Christians, or the new Christians, returned to practicing Judaism. They became organized enough even to discipline errant members of the community. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes that had given tolerance to Protestants since 1598. The previous 2 centuries had witnessed ever-increasing solidarity between Jews and Huguenots or French Calvinists, so that it was now hard to tell them apart. now hard to tell them apart. Okay, Calvinists, Huguenots, and Jews, how can you not tell them apart? As Lavender points out, Protestantism, like Judaism, had a mutual enemy in Catholicism because of the Inquisition. Adherents of both sects were heretics in the eyes of the authorities. Indeed, the revocation targeted, penalized both, and the threat of expulsion came to weigh upon the new Christians. Example, the Spanish Portuguese Jews in France. As well, the rise of Protestantism in Western Europe added to the insecurity of Catholicism and was one factor leading to the reinstated Inquisition. Obviously, any road goes into two directions. And if there were Jews in France, we can expect also to find Huguenots in Spain. Huguenots in 1565 in Pamplona, the capital of Spanish Navarre. French Huguenots were rounded up and deported, writes Lavender, while in Toledo during the same year, a tribunal brought charges against individuals who included Protestants. A second reason why Jews and Huguenots found common cause with each other was the Protestantism, like Judaism, had a special appeal to merchants and to the financially well-off and well-educated segments of society. Finally, there was sympathy between the two groups because, in the words of Lavender, in removing many of the trappings of Catholicism, rituals, liturgy, saints, a church hierarchy, etc., Protestantism returned to a more original Christianity, which was closer to Judaism. Original Christianity? What does that have to do with being an Israelite or Hebrew? It has been estimated that at the end of the period of tolerance toward Huguenots and beginning of their large-scale flight in 1685, they numbered more than 800,000 people spread across France. Significantly, they were concentrated in the very region where Jewry could boast a continuous presence from Roman times to the high Middle Ages. Now, I just want to point out, I did read and show that a lot of these Pisos or Hellenistic Jews were coming from the same region, in the Narbonne region here in France. We read that. You know, Piso's family seems to have been coming from there. So are these really just strictly Israelite, like Jewish 100%? Got to really think about that. Again, since Roman times to the Middle Ages. And a meticulous survey based on contemporary records between 1660 and 1670, Philip Benedict places 80% of France Protestants or Calvinists in the south. Guyenne, corresponding approximately to the province of Aquitaine and former Principality of Toulouse, had the highest number, 100,000. After the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and guarantees of religious freedom were removed, they would come to constitute 1/4 of the population of Amsterdam and practically the entire east end of London. All right, so a lot of, again, these Sephardic Jews and Moors ended up in these places, right? Remember, New Jerusalem was in Amsterdam, and we got a lot of these merchants, you know, in London. In South Carolina, they would make up about 1/5 of the initial colonists, okay? The tiny island of Ré, near the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle, was an important place of refuge from 1681 to 1686. So again, remember, La Rochelle was filled with a lot of these Moorish, Huguenot, Sephardic Jews. A lot of these people from La Rochelle actually ended up in Acadia, became known as Acadians. Yeah, these were the same people, the Huguenots. Go back to my Acadian video, or if you haven't seen it, go check it out. That's a great video as well. Although it was only 16 miles long, Ré was almost wholly Protestant and had several Huguenot temples on it. The names of those from Ré who settled in America strongly hint at their Judaic background and Iberian origins. We can easily trace in these the transformation of Spanish or Occitan surnames, as well as the persistence of favored Jewish given names. The former can often be recognized by the addition of "eu" or "aut," or like sounding suffixes to a Hebrew or Arabic name, a phenomenon we have noticed with the so-called Theophoric "el" or "al" and Norman names such as Riddle, Cantrell, and Tunnel. Lavender draws special attention to the naming of children with Old Testament names instead of New Testament or medieval saints' names. He finds that by the end of the 1500s in Rouen, 7 of 10 most frequent Protestant male names, number 4 through 10, were Old Testament names, such as Abraham, Isaac, Daniel, David, Jacob, Solomon, and Samuel. He observes this pattern of Huguenot naming continued, although weakening with time, in the United States. As late as the 1700 period, for example, Esther and Judith remained among the 9 most frequent female Huguenot names in Charleston, South Carolina, while Abraham, Daniel, Isaac, and Jacob were frequent male names. And again, just want to remind everybody, I actually run into this a lot of the time doing the genealogy and people's family. You'll see this pattern there as well. Even as late as 1790 in the United States, Huguenots, despite rapidly assimilating, right? Despite what? Rapidly what? Assimilating. Who? Moors, right? People of color, assimilating, and generally following non-traditional Christianity, were more likely than most other Protestant groups to have Old Testament names. The exceptions were in the Puritan areas of New England, areas which were the most traditional in their following of Christianity. Among the 16 most frequent Huguenot male names in 1790, 7, Benjamin, Samuel, Jacob, Daniel, Abraham, Isaac, David, were Old Testament names. There clearly is a connection between naming patterns and ethnic religious identity. It's not a coincidence. You might find this in your genealogy, all right? You got to think really hard about why these people keep naming their kids Hebrew, patriarch, prophet names. And here's a list here. We're going to go over. It says Huguenot refugees from the island of Ré, and the source is Bard. And so there's a couple of names: Colony, Massachusetts, and then tells possible origin Arabic. As you see, Adam de Jesus is Arabic. Pierre and Daniel Ayrault, Air, Nicholas Philos or Philo, Paul Colin, Colina. All right, so it's kind of giving you the comparison of what they're going off. So Ezekiel Barbault is Barbalha. So it tells you the state here in New York, and you guys can go through the list and pause this so you guys can see. All right, and it continues a little bit here. Elizabeth Brigard. All right, so make sure you guys can pause this if you like and go over the names on your own. A lot of names, and you can see here South Carolina comes into play, Pennsylvania, Virginia. And if you know these names, something that you might want to follow up on. Okay. Another place in France, especially sought out by refugee Jews during the diaspora, was Bordeaux, the major Atlantic port of Languedoc. To invoke again lavender in Bordeaux, as elsewhere in southern France, an indeterminate scattering of conversos remained behind. And after 1481, the Sephardic remnant was quietly enlarged by an uninterrupted infusion of new Christians from Spain and Portugal, all right? So there was some old school Hebrews there, right? In that area. And then what happened? Some new arrivals came from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. Many Moors came and joined. Virtually all of them were Judaizers, Marranos. France continued to bar Ashkenazic Jews from entry into the country, even while it allowed the settlement of these Portuguese Jews in Bordeaux. All right, so that's a big one right there. They weren't letting Ashkenazi Jews in when they were letting Portuguese Jews in. Okay, so it was not Ashkenazi Jews we're talking about. Bordeaux, Bayonne, and nearby towns, only 50 miles from the Spanish border, developed strong Sephardic communities that served as gateways to northern France, the Netherlands, England, and Scotland. In other parts of France, too, certain accommodations and recriminations were made. In 1632, for example, in Rouen, 37 new Christians were arrested for their Jewish ways, and auto de fe seemed imminent. The Jews declared their fidelity to Catholicism, however, paid money and were released. And we continue, it says, from France to the Carolinas. We have already made mention of South Carolina's very early Sephardic and Moorish history. Okay, what? South Carolina's Sephardic and Moorish history early. In 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Leon, a prominent settler and sugar grower on Hispaniola, sent an expedition to North Atlantic coast. Remember, I did a video on this. Okay, check out my video on Lucas Vasquez de Leon and how he was bringing up his Sephardic Moorish people and also some Caribs and Tainos up with him, you know, as servants to South Carolina. This is back in 1526, almost 100 years before the Virginia colonies, right, that were established later on in the 1600s. What's significant about this Lucas Vasquez de Leon period is that in their primary sources, they say they brought up so-called Negroes. So this is way before 1619. So this debunks the 1619 thing about the first so-called Negroes. The colony of 500 settlers, including Leon, landed somewhere in the South Carolina coast, but met with several disasters. A year later, 150 of those colonists managed to straggle back to Hispaniola. So pay attention. The fate of the remaining ones is unknown. So out of 500 settlers, only 150 made it back, right? 350, what happened? They don't know what happened. What do you think happened, guys? A lot of those people stayed there, assimilated with the native population. Many years go by and you forget their history, and now they're just Indians. I'm not trying to make anybody un-Indian. This is just real history. There is a genealogy here also that is unknown and forgotten. We would argue that these settlers were very likely Sephardim and Moors. Again, who stayed behind? Who stayed behind? Sephardis and Moors. Moors, as there is little else to justify their being willing to leave the settled prosperity of Spanish Hispaniola to venture to the mosquito-ridden unknown coast of North America, unless the recently arrived Inquisition had caused them to recalculate their odds in a Catholic colony. In 1563, the Frenchmen were aided by Sir John Hawkins, an English privateer, which we read in chapter 1. Again, these are all people of color, John Hawkins as well. Leon is a Sephardic surname. The settlers named the place where they first made landfall the River Jordan, present-day Cape Fear River. We would advance the same reasoning for Hernando de Soto's, a Sephardic surname. All right, de Soto was a Sephardic Jew, person of color, 600-person expedition. All right, so this is the 600 so-called soldiers he brought up with him, Hernando de Soto, all right, in 1540 through the southeastern region of North America. The very first attempts at planting French colonies in the New World were inspired by Huguenots who landed in the area of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1555. It came to naught, and the same Huguenot faction planted a short-lived colony named Charleston on the South Carolina coast. Charleston was organized by Admiral Gaspard Coligny and Jean Ribault. In 1564, Coligny attempted a second French Huguenot colony at Fort Caroline on the St. Johns River, but the settlers were massacred by the Spanish. All right, so again, remember, when they're saying French Huguenot in Spanish, the Spanish in this case is most likely Catholics, because a lot of these, again, Huguenots, which we read earlier, are Spanish. So it's not like two countries fighting each other how we envision it. But in this case, Spanish means Catholic in this case, when they're saying they fought or massacred by the Spanish. Finally, in 1566, the Spanish succeeded in establishing the Santa Elena colony near the present-day borders, South Carolina and Georgia at Beaufort. The settlers numbered 1,500 men and 14 women. From Santa Elena, Captain Juan Pardo, Sephardic surname Brown, Pardo is brown, anglicized to brown, Pardo, Pardo means brown, set off on 2 expeditions, establishing forts as far westward as Knoxville, Tennessee. Santa Elena was a thriving seaport colony with craftspeople, families, and a Morisco pottery-making facility. Morisco, Moors, converted to Christianity, Moriscos, a pottery making facility of Moriscos, all right, in Santa Elena Colony, South Carolina. You guys understanding? 1500s. Santa Elena craftsmen and merchants traded with Mexico, Italy, and Spain. Some even owned Chinese porcelain. Soldiers stationed in the town were drawn from a cross-section of Spain, Marchena, Gibraltar, Cadiz, Seville, Bilbao, León, Salamanca, Toledo, and Palencia. Notably, all areas with substantial Sephardic and Morisco populations. All right. A list of names of settlers is given in Appendix J. As is readily apparent, most are almost certainly Sephardic Jewish or converso families. In 1587, after Sir Francis Drake had attacked and destroyed St. Augustine in Florida, Philip II of Spain ordered the Santa Elena residents to abandon their colony and resettle to the south in St. Augustine. The records are unclear on how many actually did so. The position of several Melungeon researchers is that the Santa Elenans did not move en masse to Florida, or rather migrated inland toward the Appalachians. If many were indeed of Jewish and Islamic descent, this would have been the wisest course of action, as La Florida was becoming increasingly pressured by the Inquisition, right? There was too many Catholics over there. Simultaneously, as has been suggested, the colonization of Roanoke was joined by British, Sephardim, and Moriscos, who feared the upcoming Spanish invasion of England. And we went over this in chapter 3 of this book. Make sure to get that video. All right, again, we have a video for each chapter we've gone over. By 1600, no doubt, the southern Atlantic coast was teeming with a pastiche of Spanish, French, and English colonial deserters, castaways, and abandoned souls. The presence of Europeans and their pathogens on mainland North America caused a general population collapse among the indigenous tribal people. Again, the presence of Europeans, and I'm not talking about white, so-called white Europeans. Again, a lot of these are Sephardic and Moorish people. All right, the presence of these people being there on mainland North America caused a general population collapse among the indigenous tribals people. Okay, not all skin folk are kinfolk. Entire sectors of land south of the Chesapeake Bay and westward to the Mississippi had been emptied of native populations due to European-born infectious diseases like bubonic plague, cholera, and typhoid. Deuteronomy 28, huh? It is probable that many, if not most, and possibly all of the Indians encountered by the English colonists at Jamestown were actually hybridized. Example, the surviving descendants of earlier native European unions who had passed varying degrees of immunity to their offspring. By the mid-1700s, it can be argued that no unmixed native people were left along the eastern Atlantic seaboard. All right, that can definitely be argued. You know, how does they know? But I do agree many of these people amalgamated, all right, and became part of the family, the indigenous family. South Carolina proper was not settled by the English until after 1670. But as has been frequently pointed out, the paradigm for its plantation economy was established over 60 years earlier in British Barbados. Barbados was first settled by the British in 1627, and its economic and social life was revolutionized in the 1640s by the importation of sugarcane cultivation from Brazil. Within a decade or so, Barbados became fabulously wealthy by producing not only sugar, but also its much valued byproduct, rum and molasses. Dutch Jews from Brazil were in the forefront of all these developments. All right, these are Sephardic Moorish people. The Barbadian landowners formed a novel, rich aristocracy whose wealth and materialism was built on African slave labor and international trade. All right, dodge the hijack, what Africans? In 1663, a group of settlers in Barbados in the Barbadian Adventures hired William Hilton to explore the Carolina coast and locate a hospitable area in which to establish a colony. Significantly, a certain John Gemens, Yemen, a Middle Eastern country then under Ottoman control. One of the adventurers helped draft a constitution for the colony, which provided self-government, freedom of religion, and generous land grants. Oh, very generous land grants. Barbados also sent forth an exploratory expedition in the area of the former Santa Elena colony under Robert Sanford, Sephardic surname. Dr. Henry Woodward, a physician who spoke Spanish. After some shaky efforts at establishing the colony at Cape Fear in 1666, Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, a crypto-Jew, English peer, and Freemason, exercised his rights as Lord Proprietor of Carolina and sent 3 ships and 100 English men and women to settle in Carolina. Ashley Cooper and his secretary, philosopher John Locke, Hebrew Locke, Tariff, who had spent many years in Holland among Sephardic Jews, then drafted the fundamental Constitution of Carolina, used to govern the colony, making Carolina the most religiously and socially liberal in North America. The most religiously and socially liberal in North America. It expressly mentioned Jews, heathens, and dissenters, as Edgar writes. In matters relating to religion, the Church of England would be the tax-supported church in the colony that would satisfy hardcore Anglicans. For dissenters from the Church of England, there was the promise of religious freedom to anyone who believed in God. Not only could non-Anglicans settle freely in Carolina, but 7 individuals could form a church or profession of faith that would be officially recognized. Religious toleration meant more than freedom to establish a congregation. No person whatsoever shall disturb, molest, or persecute another for his speculative opinions in religion or his way of worship. And legal matters, an affirmation in lieu of an oath, was an invitation to Quakers. Who are the Quakers, right? Let's go back to that chapter. Not only could Huguenots worship as they wished, but upon subscribing to the fundamental constitutions, they could become naturalized citizens. And the stipulations of believing God, not Christ, meant that Jews and Muslims were welcome. The only religious profession not tolerated was Roman Catholicism, all right? They were trying to keep the Catholics out. They was trying to make a haven for them. A view quite in keeping with the politics of Restoration England. With the exception of Rhode Island, this was the most tolerant religious policy in English America. The right to vote in South Carolina, however, was dependent upon possessing land. So you couldn't vote if you didn't have land. That's deep right there. The Lord's proprietors and their associates controlled most of that. Roughly 40% of each county, while the remaining 60% was divided among freemen. Both the proprietors and settlers originated largely in British-held Barbados and other Caribbean islands. That's where they were coming from. South Carolina historian Edgar lists prominent settler names as Beaton, Colleton, Daniel, Drayton, Fenwick, Gibbs, Godfrey, Ladson, Middleton, Moore, Shanghai, I can't even read that, Shanghai, and Gemens, all of Barbados, Amory, Paris, Pinckney and Wally of Jamaica, Lucas, Mott, and Perry of Antigua. So you see where all these people coming from the Caribbean. Lourdes and Rollins of St. Christopher's, Lamont of Grenada, and Woodward of Nevis. All right, all from the Caribbean. Notably, about half of these names are identified as Sephardic or Moorish. All right, Sephardic or Moorish. And I know a lot of this info, people are like, nah, we Indians, nah. I'm not saying you guys ain't. I'm just trying to tell you that these are the colonists that were coming in, right? There was colonists coming in, right? So they weren't white. That's what I'm showing you. They weren't white colonists. And a lot of these people amalgamated. Now, earlier they said that there was no unmixed Indian. Now, remember what happened in South Carolina with the native populations. There was more so-called slaves being exported from South Carolina then slaves were being imported. They were making room for themselves here. Besides recruiting their fellow British Caribbeans, the Lord Proprietor also sought out Huguenots as settlers, due, one may surmise, to their Sephardic Morisco affinity and enmity towards Spain, the colonial power to the south. Pamphlets were distributed in French to Huguenot refugee communities in Ireland. They were passing out pamphlets, hey, come to the promised land, America, to the Moors and Sephardic Jews, right? They were passing out these pamphlets. When Louis XIV repealed the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had provided religious freedom to non-Catholics in France, thousands of Huguenots fled France. 1,500 of them made their way to South Carolina. Edgar reports that prominent surnames among these colonists were Bonneau, the Davidic good name, Cordis, de Saussure, de Vaux, Dubos, Foret, which is the Silva, Gaillard, Gendron, Gerard, Hori, which is Moroccan, Huger, Lawrence, Leguer, Manigault, Marion, Perry, Porcher, Pricolu, Ravenel, Simons, and Timothy. Again, several are identifiable as Sephardic Morisco. In 1764, an additional 300 Huguenot settlers arrived in hopes of developing the silk and wine industries. The same two Sephardic Moorish dominated industries attempted in the Virginia colony, okay? Wine and silk, that was a Sephardic Moorish industry. Most of the incoming settlers were drawn from La Rochelle and Bordeaux, two French cities with large Sephardic Morisco populations. Earlier in the 1720s, Purisburg, on the left bank of the Savannah River, had been settled by around 800 French-Swiss settlers, which we have argued elsewhere were primarily of Jewish and crypto-Jewish ancestry, okay? The 1740s and 1750s saw an influx of 1,500 German Protestants from the Palatine region. The Palatines, remember what Benjamin Franklin was saying about these German Palatines that were coming in? He was like, why are we bringing these German, so-called black Germans over here, these Swarthy Germans? Why? Remember, Benjamin Franklin said that in the 1700s, same period. In chapter 6 on Pennsylvania, we developed a detailed proposal that the majority of incoming German Palatine Protestants were of Sephardic, Ashkenazic, and Morisco origin Moors. The surnames among these which Edgar lists as prominent in the South Carolina community are Amaker, Boozer, Geiger, violinist, Harmon, Dutch, Huto, Ina Binet, Kalstason, Lever, Levor, Levat, Lorick or Lorik, Rast, Sheely, Shieli, Schuler, Deis, Wanamaker, and Siegler. Again, we are seeing a preponderance of Jewish names. A group of Scot-Irish settled in the Waxhaws region in 1767, chiefly and foremost among them the Adairs. All right, remember the Adairs, John Adair, and the same argument can be made for these families, whose surnames include Adair, Breton, Caldwell, Calhoun, Coy Kendall, Logan, Montgomery, Moore, Ross, and Wardlaw. A large group of Scots had preceded them in 1746. Abercrombie, Allen, Buchanan, Bullock, Diaz, Kinloch, Logan, Mitchie, and Pringle. Similarly, when some Welsh settlers arrived in South Carolina, they named their parish St. David's. Among their surnames were Aymont, Ficklin, James, Polly, Pigs, or Pugs, or Pigus, and Wild. Many of the surnames just mentioned are not typical Celtic or Welsh surnames. Rather, they are the names of Sephardic or Moorish persons who, in our view, migrated to Ulster, Scotland, and Wales from Iberia or France from 1500 onward, and were now making their way to South Carolina's promise of free land and freedom of religion. Even the settlers who Edgar identifies as being Dutch sound suspiciously Sephardic Gilon, Hayes, Eeyore, and Red. As with most traditional historians, Edgar is quite miserly in acknowledging a Jewish presence in colonial South Carolina, right? So what he's saying is that most historians, they kind of leave that out. They don't want to acknowledge that a lot of these people were kind of Moors and Sephardic Jews, right? So this is what he says. The number of Jewish residents of colonial South Carolina was never large, probably no more than several hundred. With few exceptions, they lived in Charleston. Because of its policy of religious toleration, South Carolina attracted a sizable percentage of Jewish residents of British North America. They were primarily Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal, and they came to South Carolina via the Netherlands, England, or the West Indies. A few, however, even in the early years, were Ashkenazic. Again, a few. Even this guy who doesn't want to acknowledge them too much, he's even saying it wasn't really Ashkenazic, it was very few. It was actually Sephardic Moorish people. In 1697, the names of 4 Jews appear among those of Huguenots who were naturalized under the Alien Act. One of them was Simon Valentine, an alien of the Jewish nation who had emigrated from Jamaica. All right, so that was Edgar, one of the most famous historians of South Carolina. He's admitting a little bit of it, okay? Others included Avila, Cohen, the Costa. Remember the Costa, we got a whole video on them. Example, Costa or Custis, de Oliveira, Lindo, Salvador, and Tobias. Historians have missed one of the Jewish families in the early colonies, Cooper. This, as it happens, is a family with ancestors common to both authors. The brothers William and Joseph Cooper came to Charleston from Barbados in 1698. Joseph was a translator, a linguist, and operated in Counting and Customs House on the waterfront, while William was stationed on the frontier in Chilwee, the trading post in Cherokee territory located across the river from present-day Augusta, Georgia. The Board of Commissioners of the Indian Trade met at Joseph Cooper's. William facilitated the visit of Sir Alexander Cummins. Cummins, thought to be possibly a crypto-Jewish clan, to the middle and upper towns on his quest in 1730 to win the Cherokees' allegiance to Britain. He snatched 7 Cherokee braves, including the boy Ataku Lakula, ferried them to London, and had them lay the crown of Tennessee, the priest king's otter hat, at the feet of King George II. Later, Cummins came up with another scheme involving the Carolina Cherokees. He sold shares in a company organized to resettle 500 European Jews among the Indians in the midst of the Appalachians. Who were they living amongst? The Indians. Who? 500 what? 1,000 Sephardic Jews, all right, people of color, Moorish people, all right, living where? Among the Indians. You think none of them mixed? Although nothing came of the venture, it is interesting that the number corresponds rather well to the estimated contemporaneous population of Ashkenazi Jews in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, where Cummins had served in the army. His proposal can be viewed as one Jew's advocacy plan to rescue fellow Jews. In 1700, James Moore became governor of South Carolina. Only 2 years later, he led a military expedition to invade Catholic Spanish Florida, capturing, looting, and burning the town of St. Augustine. Then again in 1703, 1704, Moore led an army of 50 whites and 1,000 Creek Indian allies on a rampage through the Spanish Catholic mission settlements in central and western Florida. South Carolina's military successes severely damaged Spain's prestige and greatly enhanced England's standing among the Indians of the Southeast. In our view, the South Carolinian attacks on Spanish Florida were likely motivated by revenge 2 centuries after the fact for the Sephardic and Moorish exile from Iberia. Among other governors of South Carolina with likely Sephardic or Morisco ancestry are Seth Suto, Thomas Boone, the good name, again, William Campbell, Charles Greville, Montagu, and William Bull, Toro, or Shore. Also, South Carolina's planter and merchant elite was drawn almost exclusively from persons bearing Sephardic or Morisco surnames, all right? Moors, Bull, Drayton, Izzard, Norman, and Arabic, all right? Austin, Bill, de la Cornelier, Vander Dusen, and Rag. All of these were at least publicly Christian due to the South Carolina Election Act of 1721. This defined a voter as a free, white Christian male, 21 years of age, who owned 50 acres of land or paid 20 shillings currency, 25.50 in taxes, and lived in South Carolina for at least 1 year. The result of such a law would be to prompt most persons of Jewish or Muslim ancestry to be circumspect about practicing their faiths, to say the least. Yet despite their crypto status, despite their secret status, right, Jews and Moors and their descendants made important contribution to South Carolina's culture and economy throughout the colonial period. Who? Descendants of who? Sephardic Jews and Moors. Descendants of who? The Sephardic Jews and Moors made an important contribution to South Carolina's culture and economy throughout the colonial period. This is real history, real genealogy. One of the South Carolina's major agricultural crops during this time was indigo. The dye plant was introduced by Elizabeth Lucas, and its processing was developed by Andrew DeVaux, both of whom have likely Sephardic ancestry. Moses Lindo, an openly Jewish settler, was the colony's indigo export inspector in 1762, and key producers included John B., James Stobo, Robert Sams, George Mitchell, Isaac Hayne, Charles Pinckney, and John Hudson, most of whom bear Sephardic Morisco surnames. It is largely the same story with Carolina's silk industry. Many French Huguenots and newly minted English, right, in parentheses, colonists entered South Carolina and North Carolina via Ireland. So a lot of these Moorish people, Sephardic Jews, came from Ireland, all right, and they were classified as Irish, but a lot of them were actually from Spain and Portugal. The heritage is Huguenot, Moorish, Sephardic. Thus, they swelled the ranks of the so-called Scotch-Irish settlers, who are estimated to account for about 1/3 to half of the whole population of the South. The largest migration of Irish and Scottish people occurred after the Battle of Culloden in 1745, when Prince Charles Edward Stuart was defeated and the Jacobite rebellion against England was lost for good. But the roots of Irish immigration to the Americas were much deeper. The process can be said to have been jump-started when William III, son of William II, Prince of Orange, stadtholder of the United Provinces of the Netherlands, began his campaign against Irish Catholics. Spoils of war went to Presbyterian Ulster Scots and French Huguenots. This Celtic fringe, however, as it has become known in the nostalgia inherited from the Victorian era, was not altogether Celtic or even British in ethnicity or uniformly Christian in faith. All right, they're not even any of those people. The tolerant Carolinas acted as a magnet for all sorts of nationalities. Those who were better off sailed straightway to Charleston, while those of modest means took the Great Wagon Road that led from Potomac down the Shenandoah Valley. It is said that the first wave of arrivals in Hillsborough District, just across the Virginia line, were almost 100% Celtic. The road cut through the Piedmont to Fayetteville and was so busy day and night that previous travelers had provided it with carved signposts that could be read with the fingers on a dark night. That many of these Irishmen were of recent French Huguenot provenance, and before that of Spanish Jewish origin, can be seen in a compilation of genealogies covering some of South Carolina's famous colonial surnames. In fact, as historian Lyburn repeatedly points out, the Scotsmen changed their way of identifying themselves as it suited them, alternating between Irish, Ulster, Scottish, English, British, and other designations such as Presbyterian or Quaker. Again, what were they though? They were Huguenots, Moors. Abadie, James Abadie, Doctor of Divinity, was a native of Ney and Bern. He was born in London, 1727, and became Dean of Killaloe in Ireland. Barr, a Protestant family of Pontgibaud, near Rochelle, members of which settled in Ireland. Peter Barr married Miss Rabotou, a refugee. He was an alderman of Dublin and carried on a large business as lines draper. His son Isaac was adjutant general of the British forces under Wolfe at Quebec. In 1776, Colonel Barr was made vice treasurer of Ireland and privy councillor. Batts. Three of the sons of Joseph de Batts, Seigneur of Gué, escaped from France into Holland and entered the service of the Prince of Orange, whom they accompanied in his expedition to England. Two of those sons, who were captains of infantry, were killed at the Boyne. Bailey. The Huguenot name is derived from Philippe de Bailux. All right, Bailey as Bailux as Huguenot, a French refugee who settled in the neighborhood of Thorney Abbey circa 1656. Since then, the name has assumed the following forms: Baliou, Baliol, Bailey, Bailey, and Bailey. Belcastel. Pierre Belcastel de Montvalent was a refugee officer from Languedoc who entered the service of William of Orange. Blaquier. John de Blaquier took refuge in England in 1685. He married Mary Elizabeth de Varinis, the daughter of a refugee. One of his sons settled at Lisburn, and his sister married John Crommelin, from worker. The fifth son, John, held various public offices, was made a baronet in 1784, and in 1800 was raised to the peerage as Lord de Blaquier of Arcueil in Ireland. Boileau. Charles, son of Jacques Boileau, served in the English army as captain of infantry and afterwards settled as a wine merchant in Dublin, where he died. His son Simeon was succeeded by Solomon Boileau. Now just bear with me if I'm pronouncing the names wrong. I'm doing my best, okay? Bonnell. Thomas Bonnell took refuge in England and settled in Norwich, where he became mayor. His son was Daniel Bonnell, merchant of London, father of Samuel Bonnell, who became accountant general for Ireland and was succeeded in that office by his son. Beauherard. Elias Beauherard, medical doctor and doctor of divinity, settled in Dublin, where he was appointed librarian to Marsh, now known as St. Patrick's Library. One of his sons, John, entered into holy orders, and another became town major of Dublin. This town major, Beauherard, changed his name to Borrow or Baruch. Brocas or Bracha, Hebrew prayer. The very Reverend Theophilus Brocas was a scion of this family, which held numerous lordships in the south of France, mostly in the neighborhood of Bordeaux. He escaped from France at the revocation, and having taken holy orders, was appointed by the crown to the deanery of Killala and vicarage of St. Anne's, Dublin. For his valuable services in promoting the arts and manufactures of Ireland, he was presented with the freedom of the city of Dublin. He died in 1766 and was interred in St. Anne's churchyard in Dublin. Burgess. A member of this family, Valery or Valerian de Bourgeois, came to England with one of the earliest bodies of immigrants and settled at Canterbury. Most of the earliest Huguenot refugees in England landed in Kent. From successive intermarriages, the name became almost unrecognizable as a Huguenot origin, all right, the Burgess, and so was then changed to Burgess, all right, Moors. But the pedigree of the family can be clearly traced back to the Burgess family of Picardy, who were seigneurs of Gamache and Oedi and of the De La Fosse. A Burgess was soon found as an Indian trader in the Carolinas, okay? Kailemote, Le Calimote, younger, son of the Marquis de Rouvigny, commanded a Huguenot regiment at the Battle of the Boyne, where he was killed. Cambon, a refugee French officer, who commanded one of the Huguenot regiments raised in London in 1689, fought at the Boyne and at Athlone and died in 1693. Car or Carré. Of this family of Poitou, several members emigrated to England and others to North America. In Ireland, the name has changed to Carey and Carré. Chagnou, Louis, John, and Stephen Chagnou were refugees from Saint Cyrene in the Charente, where the family owned landed estates. They settled in Dublin and prospered. Louis sat for Gowran in the Irish Parliament. Another held a benefice in the church. John had two sons, Colonel William Chagnou and John, who was treasurer of the ordinance. The great-grandson of Stephen was called to the Irish bar in 1793 and eventually purchased the estate of Baron in the county Westmeath. Chamberlain, Peter Chamberlain, a physician of Paris, fled into England at the massacre of French Calvinists on St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24, 1572. He was admitted a member of the College of Physicians and obtained extensive practice in London, where he died. Champagne, Robillard de Champagne, a noble family in Saintonge, several of whom took refuge in England and Ireland. The children of Josias de Robillard, Chevalier of Champagne, under charge of their mother, escaped from La Rochelle, concealed an empty wine cask, and arrived safe at Plymouth, England. Their father went to the Netherlands. Cheneviques, a distinguished Lorraine family, dispersed at the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. The Reverend Philip Cheneviques fled to England, and the family afterwards settled in Ireland. Philip's son entered King's Guards. His grandson became Bishop of Killaloe in 1745, and afterwards of Waterford and Lismore. Colot de Lescurie, a refugee officer from Noyon, who escaped from France at the revocation and joined in Holland the army of William of Orange, was major in Schomberg's regiment at the Boyne. His eldest son, David, was a captain of dragoons. Another, Simeon, was colonel of an English regiment. Cousin. This name is now often rendered cousin, as well as cousins, as in the television producer's name Norman Cousins. D'Argent, a refugee family from Sancerre, some members of which settled in England and Ireland at the revocation. Two of them served as officers in the guards of William III. The name has been changed to Dargan. De Laval, Vicomte de Laval, possessed estates in Picardy, but at the revocation took refuge in Ireland, settling at Portalington. De la Valade, or De la Valade. Several members of this family settled in Lisburn, in the north of Ireland. Des Vaux Vinchon de Vaux, second son of de Bacencourt, took refuge in Dublin, where he became minister of the French Church in conjunction with Reverend Peter Droz. He commenced about 1742 the publication of the first literary journal which appeared in Ireland. De Olier, Bertrand de Olier, was capitol of Toulouse as early as 1364. Edward Olier was made Marquis of Nointel in 1656. His third son eventually settled in Dublin. Dombrain. Other forms of this name were de Embrum and de Abram. Jacques de Embrum fled from the town of Embrum near Gap in the Horace Alpes in 1572 and escaped into Rouen, crossed the Channel in an open boat on 19 August 1572 and settled in Canterbury. Drelincourt, Peter, son of Charles Drelincourt, came to England where he entered the English church and eventually became Dean of Armagh. Du Bedad. The head of this family was the Marquis du Bedad, some of whose descendants are now living in Ireland. Du Bourdieu, a noble family of Bern. Isaac du Bourdieu was for some time minister of the Savoy Church in London. Duport, a family of Poitou, several members of which took refuge in England and Ireland, the name has been changed to Porty. Dury. Paul Dury was an eminent officer of engineers who entered the service of William III and afterwards passed into the service of the Elector of Hesse. Two of his sons served in the English army, the elder of whom belonged to the regiment of La Meloniers and was killed at the Boyne. Duval. Many refugees from Rouen of this name settled in England. Fossil. René de la Fossil belonged to an ancient Angevin family, entered the service of the Prince of Orange, and became captain of grenadiers in the regiment of Calais Motte Rovigny, and fought with at the Battle of the Boyne. King William appointed him governor of the port town and county of Sligo. Fleury. Louis Fleury, Protestant, pastor of Tours, fled into England in 1683. His son Philip Amoret came to Ireland as a Protestant and settled there. The son of Philip Amoret became Vicar General of Lismore, and his son George Louis Fleury became Archdeacon of Waterford. Foret. Marquis de La Foret, a major general in the British Army, served in the Irish campaign of 1699. Gosson. There were several branches of the family in France. David Gosson, who took refuge in Ireland in 1685, came from Lunel and Languedoc. Descendants of his lived at Antrim, Belfast, and Dublin. The Gossons who settled in England were also from Languedoc, right? Huguenots. Again, he's going over these famous Huguenot families that eventually settled in England and Ireland or Scotland. And, when they came in, people only recognized them in history as Scots, Irish, English, but they were more than that. Genisti or Hennessy. Louis Hennessy took service under the Prince of Orange and fought at the Battle of the Boyne in the regiment of Lord Lifford. Gosset. Goss, Gist, Guess. All right, look at that. Guess, like clothing. Guess, Guest, Gossi, Costa. A Huguenot family originally from Normandy. The Guess, all right, Guess is Moors, originally from Normandy. The Normans which first settled in Jersey, from where some of the younger branches passed over into England. Among the members of the elder branch of the family was Matthew, for many years Vicomte of Jersey, who died in 1842, Major General Sir William Gosset, who held the office of Under Secretary State for Ireland, was sometime member of the Parliament for Truro, and for several years Sergeant-at-Arms to the English House of Commons. Gost. John, son of Daniel Gost, a French Protestant refugee, settled in Dublin about 1684. His son John was born in that city in 1715, and having entered into holy orders was elected to perform the duty of pastor to the French Protestant congregation at Portalington. Goyer or Goya, all right? This family name is famous in Spanish countries like Puerto Rico, Goya. And you can see that a lot of the Goya, the food products, that's the founders right there. Peter Goyer, and they were Huguenots, all right? Peter Goyer, a refugee manufacturer from Picardy, settled at Lisburn in Ireland. Guali or Guale, again, Guali or Guale, Peter Guali, son of the Sieur de la Gineste of Rourke, fled to England at the revocation with his wife and 3 children. This became the name of a remote tribe of mixed African and Indian people on adjacent islands. All right, dodge the hijack with the African is because it's just them. It's the Moors. It's not Africans, it's the Moors. All right, it's them, it's Huguenots, Sephardic Jews, not Africans, and Indian people, right? Gilot, Berber. Several members of this family immigrated to the Netherlands at the revocation and received from the Prince of Orange commissions in his navy. Their descendants settled in Lisburn in Ireland. Guyon, William de Guyon de Guise or Guest, son of the Sieur de Pamplona, fled the Netherlands at the revocation and took service under William of Orange, in which he lost an arm. Hamon, an ancient Norman family, 2 brothers, Hamon, who settled at Portarlington in Ireland, were of that family. The name has in some cases been changed to Hammond. Hazard. which is Arabic. Peter Hazard, or Hazaret, fled from the persecutions in the Low Countries under the Duke of Parma during the Spanish occupation, returning on a visit to his native land. He was seized and burned alive in 1568. Descendants of his still survive in England and Ireland under the name of Hazard. Labatt, or Labatt, Lobato, a branch of this family, has been long settled in Ireland. The first Labatt came over with William III as an officer in his army. Labatts became important Indian traders on the American and Canadian frontier. Langlis, the Englishman. This Normandy family name has been changed to Langley. Larive, this refugee who settled in Ireland, escaped from France with his wife by pretending to be sellers of oranges, a traditional Jewish occupation, and going about with a donkey and panniers. When they reached the Netherlands, the Prince of Orange gave him a commission, and Larive fought bravely in the Irish campaigns. By some of the family, this name has been changed to Reeves, a Melungeon name. Huguenots often escape by disguising themselves as servants, gypsies, travelers from foreign countries, and the like, okay? La Roche, a refugee from Bordeaux, originally named Crotairdy, whose son became a member of parliament for Bodmin in 1727. La Rochefoucauld. Frederick Charles de La Rochefoucauld, Count de Roye, left France at the revocation and entered the Danish service, attaining the post of Grand Marshal. He afterwards settled in England and died at Bath in 1690. His son Frederick William was made a lifetime peer under the title of Earl of Lifford in Ireland. Latrobe. Jean Latrobe, a refugee from the south of France, came to Ireland by way of the Netherlands and settled in Waterford about the year 1690. Layard, an ancient Albigensian family, whose original name was Raymond, Spanish, de Layardi, near Montpellier, being merely their nom de terre, as in many other similar cases. Le Fanu, or Dafano. Etienne Le Fanu of Caen married in 1657 and after some time made his escape into England and eventually settled in Ireland. Lefroy, Froze or Foys, Antoine Lefroy, a native of Cambrai, took refuge in England from the Low Countries about the year 1587 and settled in Canterbury, where his descendants followed the business of silk, dying until the death of Thomas Lefroy in 1723. Anthony Lefroy settled at Leghorn, once a Jewish port, in 1728 and died there in 1779. Laguerre or Laguerre, Jean Bernard Laguerre, a refugee musician, inventor of the method of musical notation which bears his name, settled as teacher of music at Dublin. All right, we're talking about a Moorish person, all right, inventor of musical notation, where he died in Dublin. Mangan. Several refugees of this name settled in Ireland. Paul Mangan became established as Lisburn, and there married Madeleine, the daughter of Louis Crommelin. Matty was a celebrated physician and author. After a residence in Holland, he settled in England about the middle of the 18th century. He was secretary of the Royal Society in 1758 and was afterwards appointed librarian of the British Museum, in which office he was succeeded by his son. This name has been changed into Matthew. Massieres. Peter de Massieres was a lieutenant in the French army and afterwards joined the army of William of Orange. He settled at Donegal in Ireland, where he died in 1746. Mercier, which means fabric worker. Philip Mercier, a portrait painter born at Berlin of a French refugee family, settled in London, where he died in 1760. In Ireland, the name has been changed into Mercer. Morrow. Daniel Morrow was born in a village in Champagne about the period of the revocation and lost his parents at an early age. His foster brother, Stephen County, fled with him into the Netherlands under the guidance of a party of refugees. On reaching manhood, both entered the army of William III and fought under him through the Irish campaigns. Normand, now Norman, all right, so they don't explain much, but letting you know that's also a Huguenot name. Perrin, Count Perrin was a Huguenot refugee from Norre, where he had large possessions. He originally settled at Lisburn in Ireland, from which he afterwards removed to Waterford. Rabotou, John Charles Rabotou, a refugee from Pont Gibaud near Rochelle, settled in Dublin and prospered as a wine merchant. Rainet, or de Rainet, Reine or Raina, a refugee family which settled at Waterford, the freedom of which city was conferred in perpetuity on the descendants of Henry de Rainet. But Henry's youngest son returned to France, and having professed the Roman Catholic religion, he was placed in possession of the family estate, which his descendants of the female line still hold. Roche, or Roca, La Roche, Rocas, Louis Roche, a refugee manufacturer settled in Lisburn. He became an extensive merchant, and descendants of his are now living in Belfast. Toulon, or Tolan, Toulouse, capital of Jewish Principate. An ancient family of Nimes, descended from Mark Tolan, Sieur de Goural. Peter and Anthony fled from France at the time of revocation and settled at Greenwich. Peter came into Ireland and founded the County Cork branch of the family. Torres, from Toro, a city in Spain. Raphael Torres was a physician born in France, but a refugee in England. He died in 1625, leaving behind him a son, John, who studied medicine at Oxford and became fellow at the College of Physicians at Dublin in 1627. Victoria. Queen Victoria is descended from Huguenot ancestress Eleanor de Esmeers. Again, Queen Victoria is a Huguenot Moor, person of color, Sephardic Jew or Moor. All right, Queen Victoria, descendant from Eleanor de Esmeers, Marquise de Albreus, who was her great-great-great-grandmother. A great-grandparent was also Saxus, hence the name of her duchy and dynasty, Saxe-Coburg, which the royal family is said to have hated. So that's a big one right there in the genealogy of Queen Victoria. Additional insight can be gleaned into the private lives of Carolina's crypto-Jews also by scanning the names of brides and grooms from the old 96 and Abbeville districts. The given and surnames are markedly Sephardic Morisco, all right, Moorish. At least one levirate marriage, Lipscomb, is reported. Some names such as Mahafa, Sharif, Alamsa, Aladdin, Mahala, and Arkaja appear to be straightforwardly Arabic, while others such as Vashti, Tokoa, Palestine, Israel, and Brazil would seem to be unequivocally Sephardic, all right, Sephardic. Among the Irish forebears of one of the authors are the Denays, said to have immigrated to Pennsylvania and Virginia and to have passed through South Carolina on their migration south. Once in Georgia and Alabama, they set up mills and stores. Ultimately, or rather intermediately, the Denny name can be traced to a Robert Denny who lived in 17th century Ireland. Then it disappears, often a sign it came from elsewhere. Indeed, there is a coat of arms claiming a French origin for the name, Denis, which may in turn lead to Spanish roots and the Berber Arabic surname Danan or Dana. First names in the Denny family tree excerpted below seem decisively Jewish. Sudarth, Asenith, Seneth, Shered, all Arabic. Assyria, Benjamin, David, Elijah, Joshua, Josiah, Jeremiah, Lazarus, Noah, Samuel, Zechariah, Obadiah, Orpha, Rebecca, Rachel, Sarah, Senaiah, Tabitha, all Hebrew. Irby, Effie, Eva, Adeline, Lillian, all Jiddish. Lala, Lula, Census, Senus Rosa, all Portuguese. Example, Sinai's Rosa, or Rose of Sinai. Irene, Eunice, Bernice, Melita, Adelphia, all Greek. And Cornelia and Lesina, both Italian. Many of the marriage partners bear Jewish surnames. Sarah Wise Felton, Lucy Storer or Story, Henry Yates, co-author of Daniel Yates' great-grandfather, Rebecca Vanderpool, Anne Folk, form of Raphael, Martha Bertram, Bergom Tunisian, Thomas Elihu Hand, Joshua Francis Raines, Polly Hannah, Noni Gay, and Margaret Cohorn or Cohen. And it says here, descendants of Samuel Denis. So Samuel Denis was born about 1715 in Albemarle County in Virginia. And this would be his descendants right here. So you guys can take a look, pause if you need to, the video. All right, someone just scroll down slowly so you guys can see. And we're there and then up. So they're going from North Carolina, from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Then they're going over to Alabama or Georgia, right? Alabama and Georgia, okay. And we continue here, down through Georgia still in Alabama. The Denis. And these are, again, the descendants. All right, so this Denis genealogical chart right here. Huguenots set the tone of the Carolina colony. Again, Huguenots set the tone of the Carolina colony with their wealth, professional backgrounds, and gentility. It is sometimes hard to distinguish them from Sephardic Jews. Very hard, very hard. Charleston became the fourth oldest Jewish community in the American colonies after New York, Philadelphia, and Savannah. With the establishment of Beth Elohim in 1749, the old DaCosta family plot served as the location of the Cumming Street Cemetery, founded in 1764. Charleston's overtly Jewish population of 500 constituted the largest, wealthiest, and most cultured Jewish community in the colonies. Until about 1830, it had the largest Jewish population of any city in the United States, okay? Unlike New York, Philadelphia, or most other American Jewish communities, with the notable exception of Savannah. It never experienced the slightest repugnance from its host city. Part of that goodwill undoubtedly came from the Jews, fellow travelers, the Huguenots. Was it surprising then that Charleston became the birthplace of the Reformed Judaism movement in the 1840s, or that South Carolina voted the first Jew to public office, Francis Salvador, a newly arrived immigrant in 1774, elected to the first provincial Congress? As we have seen, South Carolina's Jewish roots are very deep indeed. Its Muslim element in the colonial period, moreover, are not insignificant, okay? Muslims were there heavily, all right? Again, this was chapter 8, Huguenot, South Carolina. We just read from the book, Jews and Muslims in British Colonial America, a genealogical history.